So we're going to provide an overview of good business practices. We'll talk about the pre-K reconciliation as it relates to specific line items. And we'll also discuss how to prepare for an agreed upon procedures review. So that's the what we have as our agenda for this morning. Now, we have a few learning outcomes. So, at the end of this session, you should be able to understand the expectation to employ sound business practices. You'll be able to recognize the benefits of effective financial management. You'll realize the correlation between effective financial management and pre-K financial management. You'll be able to walk away with some strategies to help you support those expenses that you report on your pre-K reconciliation, and you will have a better understanding of the purpose and the process associated with an agreed upon procedures review. And finally, we will hope that you'll walk away with some best practices when it comes to preparing for an agreed upon procedures review if you are in fact selected. So, with that said, I want to start off with a poll question. And as I mentioned earlier, if you will type your response in the chat to everyone, but what comes to mind when you hear the word good as it relates to business? What are some of the things that come to mind when you hear good as it relates to business? Okay, I see some responses. Responsible, successful, excellent, honest, and keeping those books straight. That is fantastic. Right. So when you think of good or good business practices, some of the things that you listen or that you would hear is reliable, trustworthy, suitable, appropriate, effective, proficient, right? Successful, as you said, positive. These are all attributes of good business practices. And why that is important is that it's already expected as a business, an operating, functional, viable business before you even heard about Georgia Pre-K, that you employ good business practices. So those additional rules and regulations or expectations associated with Georgia Pre-K are no different. It's not burdensome because you're already doing things that make you a good business person, whether you work for a for-profit or a public or a not-for-profit entity. And so good business practices are positive, effective legal processes and procedures that are not only followed, but they're put in place and monitored by a company and their employees, with the overall goal of, you know, great business practices and achieving the company's goals and objectives. And that's important when it comes to pre-K because we want to make sure that you take those same characteristics, that same mindset, those same activities, and move them right on over to Georgia pre-K operations. And so when you think of financial management is essentially when you plan and direct, monitor, or organize all of the monetary resources within your organization. So good business practices coupled with general financial management will equal success when it comes to Georgia Pre-K and monitoring and reporting how funds were used. So there are definitely several benefits for effective financial management. Financial management allows you, or effective financial management allows you to have great or sound business decision. It gives you an opportunity to assess the profitability of not only a specific program, but your overall operations. It evaluates your capacity to be able to run a program like Georgia Pre-K and to plan for that growth, right? If you want to add additional classrooms and things like that. So, as a individual or individuals that operate certain aspects of a business or are responsible for operating the entire business, you are already employing effective financial management practices, and those benefits will spill over to pre-K because those same things that you do to run day-to-day operations as it relates to financial management and just general operations will apply to pre-K. It doesn't require any additional skill set, is the net of what I'm communicating. So when we talk about financial management, that would include things like budgeting, record keeping, bookkeeping, cash flow, financing, and ultimately reporting. And so with that, in business in general, you're already doing those kinds of things. And so the same thing applies to pre-K. And the illustration of this slide is to pretty much give you a visual to let you know that what you're already doing in your current operations, those are the exact same things that correlate to Georgia pre-K. So you have to budget. You have a budget at the beginning of the year of how much funding you're going to receive. There are record keeping requirements that you have to meet. You have to track or account for those expenses for Georgia pre-K. You have to know if you have sufficient funding coming in each month to run the program. And the funding that you receive from Georgia Pre-K may not cover 100% of what's necessary to run the program, but it is a very great supplement to be able to run this program. You have to have different financial resources at your disposal to make sure you can continue to operate, and you have to produce financial reports or financial statements. And in this case, it would be the reconciliation to show how the money was spent for Georgia Pre-K. So when it comes to record keeping requires you to monitor what's going on and have evidence of that through paper and documentation. It helps you prepare for successful operations and facilitation of Georgia Pre-K, track what you're doing, and ultimately support that activity. And so, in monitoring business operations, you have certain records that help you do that. When it comes to preparing financial statements or your actual reconciliation, record keeping is a key component of that because you're going to need those source documents to prepare those financial statements. Record keeping allows you to track revenue and expenses, not only for your overall organization, but also for Georgia Pre-K. And it helps you prepare and support your tax returns to the government that you have to submit anyway, as well as your pre-K reconciliation. So again, we're just trying to lay the groundwork for illustrating how your normal business operations, those activities that you do in business, spill over and correlate directly to Georgia Pre-K and does not require any additional record keeping requirements as far as the type of documents that you would have to keep as a business. So the record keeping requirements as it relates to Georgia Pre-K are outlined in the operating guideline in several sections, sections 4.10, 17.6, and 19.5. And so, what these record keeping requirements say is that you must maintain full and complete funding and expense records pertaining to the grant agreement, your grant agreement that is signed between DeKalb and you as a pre-K provider. You have to maintain these records for 3 years. Beyond the agreement ending date, or if you have any of the following things that occur, if there's any litigation or claims that started before the original 3-year period, or if there's any audit or review findings, you have to keep those records available beyond that time period. So record keeping systems, as we know, vary from organization to organization, and they can look quite different. So it depends on how you keep your records. So the agency, just like the government, doesn't require that you use a specific system, but there are certain attributes that are required in order for you to run and manage finances when you receive governmental funds and when you're doing business in general. So, record keeping systems can be manual. They can be automated or they can be a combination of the two. So I want to take this opportunity to ask you guys, what kind of system do you use? Is your system manual, pen and paper, old school? Do you have an automated system that you use, like a financial management software, or do you do a little bit of both? You kind of have the system and then you have some supplemental spreadsheets. So share with us in the chat kind of what type of system that you have in place to manage your financial transactions. So when it comes to manual systems, that's pen and paper, right? Spreadsheets, no computer integration. When it comes to manual systems, there's a higher risk for error because it is manual, right? There's some slower processes involved, and it can become a little challenging to maintain. You're not prohibited from utilizing manual systems, but we do recognize that may not be the most efficient way to do things, but there is no prohibitions on you using a manual system. And some people like pen and paper old school. I know I like pen and paper a little bit, but I do like automation. So when you're talking about automation, you may have automated systems that do your financial things as well as your attendance systems and enrollment. It may be streamlined and fully integrated and may not require any supplemental data. So everything comes from the system. There are no additional management or additional calculations that have to be done outside of the system to get to a particular report or number. A fully automated system would have all of these things. But one thing about a fully automated system, you can't just rely on it because it's only as good as the information that is put in that system. And so if you've ever heard the term GIGO, which is garbage in, garbage out, you can have a very fancy system that's high tech that costs lots of money, but it's only as good as whoever's putting the information in the system. So, as a caution, you don't just produce records from a system and not know that the information is accurate and complete and current. And anytime you're presenting information to the state agency or any other funding source, they're not just going to rely on a report that comes out of a system. They're going to verify that that information is accurate because, again, it's only as good as what goes in. And then this is a very common, or probably the most common of the systems would be hybrid. It would be a combination of an automated system and some manual processes. So we find that there's some organizations that have a system that's programmed a certain way, but in order to communicate certain statistics or results, you track or export some of that information and manipulate that data manually, even if you're using an electronic program to do that. But hybrid simply means you're using your standardized accounting type system and you have some other component, like if you export it into Excel and then manipulate the data in Excel, well, your system is automated, but it's really hybrid when you start providing reports and things like that that may not be, that are supplemental to what comes out of the system. And like I said, that is the most common that we see. So, the importance of record keeping systems and tracking and reporting data, it allows you to track revenue expenses by program. And so you can do that by listing the account name or the account number. And so when it comes to Georgia Pre-K, what we would expect to see if you have an automated system is something that has Georgia Pre-K as a separate program, either by account name or number in your system. And also, maybe those sub accounts for that program would tie to the pre K reconciliation. So, therefore, when you're printing your information from the accounting system, it would tie directly to the pre K reconciliation. Now, even if you use different numbers or account names, you should know from your own accounting system which accounts correlate to which line items on the pre-K reconciliation. And then, of course, anything that you have in your accounting system, regardless of whether it's manual, automated, or hybrid, should be supported by source documentation. So what you use to get to the number that you put on your ledger should be source documents. So example of source documents will include things like deposits. So, what do you have to support the income or revenue transactions or deposits from pre-K? Invoices and receipts, any petty cash ledgers, canceled checks, images of canceled checks to support certain transactions, credit card statements if you use credit cards in your organization, bank statements to support that financial activity. Your written accounting policies and procedures are a key component of what will support your record keeping system and how you support tracking transactions. And any it'll speak to like your cash purchases. So if any of you utilize cash, you should have a written procedure on how that's done and how that actually flows through whatever accounting system that you use. So you need to have a ledger or a process associated with that. And if there are cash purchases, for example, that are made or purchases that are made by teachers or something like that, and you reimburse them for those purchases, what is that process and how is that recognized in your system? So these are all things that you need to be thinking about when it comes to managing and tracking your pre-K funding that you receive, regardless of what type of organization you are. So again, your record keeping system should track program revenue received by Bright from the start. Your bank statement will show that the money was actually received, and it should be received in the bank account that is under contract with the agency. And then you should be able to produce financial statements or type of financial reports that will show how much money you've received and how much you've spent of that money that you've received. So when it comes to pre-K expenditures, you can refer to section 17.0 in the pre-K operating guidelines, and OG stands for operating guidelines, when it talks about expenditures. And so for that, there are certain criteria that needs to be applied when we're talking about pre-K expenditures or expenditures of any type, really. So those expenditures have to be allowable. They have to be expenses that directly benefit pre-K. So if you have expenses as an organization that you would have, regardless of if you had pre-K, those expenses aren't necessarily allocable to pre-K. When you can demonstrate that pre-K benefited from those particular expenses that you already have, then those would be allocable to pre-K. And when you're allocating those expenses, that allocation that you use has to ensure that pre-K is only allocated its fair share of expenses. And the basis that you use for allocating those expenses should be reasonable, and it should correlate to the basis in which you're allocating. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. And in 100% of the cases, whatever you charge the pre-K must be based on actual expenses, not on budgeted expenses, not on guessing what you spend it on, but actual expenses. So there are some pre-K business rules that we want to make sure that you are aware of, right? And so it's actually Appendix E for the equipment supplies list for instructional supplies and materials. And we have teacher minimums, which this is the year of 100%. So 100% of the salaries that are funded by Bright from the Start must be paid directly to the teachers in all cases, and no more than 6% of your budget can be used on administrative costs. So there are three key business rules that we want to make sure that you know. $1,000 per classroom for instructional supplies and materials, and these are expenses that can be found in Appendix E, not Appendix H, but Appendix E of your basic equipment, materials, and supplies list. That teacher salaries must be paid at 100% of what you receive for teacher salary, regardless of whether it's the assistant or the lead. And no more than 6% of your pre-K budget can be used on pre-K administrative expenses. So, with that said, there's also some things I want to talk to you about as it relates to capital improvements. And this can be found in section 17.5 of the operating guidelines. So, capital improvements are defined as any kind of improvements that will extend the useful life or improve the quality or value of a capital asset. And so, according to Georgia Pre-K, some examples that they commonly see that programs may want to charge, but they are not allowed to, would be things associated with roofing or tile, wallpaper, air conditioning systems, alarm systems. And so, any replacement parts for capital repairs and assets uh, cannot be used or charged to the program. So purchasing or replacing or repairing capital assets is not an allowable cost. And so another thing you want to make sure that you have is supporting documentation that will support that you have allowable expenses. And this is not an all-inclusive list, but it's things like the original itemized receipts, invoices, vendor contracts, any kind of employment agreements, your grant agreement, your processes and procedures, bank statements, cancel checks, credit card statements. Depending on how you run your pre-K program and your organization will dictate the type of documents you have to maintain. So this is why it's not an all-inclusive list. There may be things that you may need to maintain on file to support how funding was used that's not on this list. But the key is that you must have full and complete records to support how the money was spent. So we're going to jump into a few poll questions. So if you're an organization that pays for things in cash, what kind of documentation would support items paid in cash? So you can put your responses in the chat. And I'm just going to check the chat to see if I see any responses coming in. So receipts. Okay. So I see the responses rolling in, which is fantastic. So if you're paying for things in cash, you would need things like receipts and itemized invoice, contracts, if that applies, pre-K operating guidelines to support that what you purchased was in fact allowable, a bank statement to show that you took the cash out. Right? Where did the money come from? A petty cash log and a corresponding policy on how cash is used, cash receipts and business financial reporting basically that shows that those transactions went through your accounting system. And so I'd like to caution those of you who do use cash. It's not necessarily uncommon to use cash for certain types of things, but you should limit your use to cash as a minimum. And also, if there are programs that pay teachers in cash, that is not a good business practice. And so you want to make sure that you are paying teachers in a way that can be supported. So you want to examine your business processes and make sure you have at a minimum these types of things to show any cash that was from Georgia Pre-K funds that was used on any types of expenses. So our next question is, what kind of documentation supports items paid with a check? And you can put your response in the chat to everyone. And so I see some of those responses coming in. And so the types of items that you need to support a check is pretty similar to that what you would need for cash, right? You would need the same kinds of things. You're going to need itemized receipts and invoices, the operating guidelines to support that what you purchased and what you used the money for was in fact allowable, bank statements, images of the canceled check, not just the bank saying check number 1234 came out of the account, but who was actually the recipient of that particular check and what was it for? And your financial business reporting that shows that these transactions are a part of your official books and records. Great job. So what kind of documentation do you need to have on file to support items that were paid with a credit card? So if you are a type of organization that utilizes credit cards to make purchases, what kind of things do you need to maintain to support those purchases? Great job. So there's some of those things are the same that you would need for cash and check, but in addition to that, you would need credit card statements. And so when it comes to credit cards, when you use a credit card, you get that itemized receipt. That itemized receipt then should agree to the credit card statement. That credit card statement should be in the name of the company that's going to pay that credit card bill, right? And so if we're saying we're making a purchase with a company card, and we're paying it with pre-K funding, that pre-K expense would need to be supported by that itemized receipt, that credit card statement, and then the payment to that credit card statement that is sufficient to cover the amount of the purchase. And so if you're paying incremental amounts and you haven't paid that full amount of that expense, you can only get credit for the portion that you've paid. So as an example, if you make a purchase of just $500 on the credit card, but you're paying $20 a month towards that credit card, you're going to get credit for those amounts that you are paying throughout the pre-K period only. You won't get credit for the full 500 if you didn't use the money for the full 500 in the end within the pre-K period. All right, great. And so our next poll question is, what documentation supports items paid initially by non-pre-K funds, but later reimbursed within the program year for pre-K funds? So if you, for example, bought some items before you got funding, and then you want to reimburse yourself or the organization for those items, what kind of documentation will help you support that reimbursement? Okay, so you're going to need the exact same kind of things, but in addition, you are going to need your reimbursement policy. So, what is your organization policy for reimbursement? So, if there were items that were purchased with non pre K funds and you now receive your pre K reimbursement and you want to say, hey, I'm reimbursing the organization for these expenses, you need to have a policy that says how that's going to happen. You're going to reimburse it at what period, at what frequency, how do you do it? If you do the reimbursement by a check, if you have separate bank accounts, things like that. So this is unique to each organization if this applies to you. So the bottom line is for you to let your records tell the story, right? Your pre-K reconciliation should be supported by source documents. And so, with that said, we're going to talk a little bit about audit and accounting requirements. But before I jump into this section, I wanted to see if from the team, if there are any questions that I need to answer about the information that is covered so far. And keep in mind, if your questions are specific to your organization, we'll respond to you directly. And if you have any questions about the content, you can put those in the chat to the host so that the host can field those responses for you.
Hi, Sharice. Right now, we don't have any questions. I will say there's a little issue with sharing responses where I think right now they're all coming directly to me and they're not going out to everyone. So I apologize. I'm trying to adjust the setting, but I haven't been able to do it yet.
Oh, it's no problem. So we're still seeing them. So I'm able to see
Okay.
the chat
I think
responses.
co-hosts
So
can
that's
see them.
great.
So, all right. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so we're going to move forward to the audit and accounting requirements, and you can refer to the operating guidelines, pre-K operating guidelines section 19.0 to get further information on this. So in section 19.1, it gives you what the requirements are. And so as a provider, you must provide an actual accounting of all expenditures as it relates to pre-K. And it should demonstrate that funds were spent in the appropriate categories for their intended uses. Allowable costs are what funds can be spent on. And the way allowable costs are defined are any of those costs that are ordinary and necessary directly benefiting pre-K, right? And that all the funding must be expended by June 30th. And so what does that word expended mean? That means it needs to have left your bank account by June 30th. That's what that means. So all funding must be spent by June 30th. So as it relates to allocations, we talked about this briefly earlier on, but there's more detail in section 19.1. But when you're talking about allocations, you should determine how things are going to be allocated at the beginning of the school year, right? And so how you're going to allocate things like rent or utilities or time, those things should be established at the onset of operations. And then your records should support in an accurate, detailed way how that allocation was determined and the basis for that allocation that you're using that would be similar to what you're allocating. So we're going to have an example of what that means, but you want to make sure that what you're doing is always supported. So it needs to use the most logical basis, right? The logical basis for a shared resource and a shared expense. And then you want to document and support that basis and support how it was allocated. So for example, if we're talking about rent, before I get into this. So if we're talking about rent or something like that, or food, then you would, and you had these different funding sources. You want to make sure that pre-K is only being allocated its fair share of that particular expense, right? So when it comes to rent, the most logical basis for rent would be something like square footage. So you wouldn't use square footage to allocate something like photocopy costs because that is not a correlating basis for that particular cost. So when we're saying use a logical basis and use a basis that correlates to that particular expense, rent is a fantastic example of that. So if you have square footage and you can identify what portion of square footage applies to pre-K versus non-pre-K, then that would be a wonderful allocation. There are other things that can be allocated, such as food. And using this illustration, this is a way that you would want to make sure that pre-K is only charged its fair share. So those three areas, if we had three different funding sources that covered the same type of expense, that would equal your total cost. So using rent as our example, Georgia Pre-K, a portion of rent could be allowable for that. Head Start might cover rent, and CACFP may also cover rental costs. But altogether, that would equal your total rent cost. So you want to make sure that Georgia Pre-K is only charged its fair share of that total cost. And to support that, you need to have documentation on what you use to determine that allocation. So if it's square footage, how do we know what the total square footage is? And how do we know what pre-K square footage is as it relates to that total? And so whatever documentation you need to tell that story is what you would need to keep on hand. So let's take a look at a few selected pre-K costs that are on the reconciliation. We're not going to go through all of them, but just a few selected ones, and those ones that are attached to the business rules that we talked about. So line 4, we know will be instructional supplies and materials. Line 8, even though it's not a business rule, it is something that we're going to talk about, which is unreimbursed food costs. 9 and 10 are your lead teacher's salaries. 13 is your assistant teacher's salaries, and administrative costs will be reported on lines 20 through 24. So when it comes to instructional supplies and materials, we know that you must spend a minimum of $1,000 per classroom, and you can find what you can use that on Appendix E as a guide, right? So if it shows up on Appendix E, then it will qualify as toward meeting that $1,000 per classroom minimum for instructional supplies and materials. When we look at instructional supplies and materials, there are some waivers that go along with that. And so it could be things like playground and classrooms that are well equipped. You would have to have a specialist verify that. So you need to keep your email address or email or approval on file for any waivers that you receive. If you have any funds that were not expended on instructional supplies and materials, you may be able to use them for other things, but you have to have written approval to do that. And typically, as a rule of thumb, they can't be used on non-instructional items, and that approval is good for 1 year. So if you got it last year and you want to do the same thing this year, you want to make sure that you get that waiver this year as well. And as always, keep your approval on file. So, as a best practice, you want to confirm the items that you're purchasing show up on Appendix E. You want to maintain your detailed receipt or invoice, make sure that it's legible and it's within the pre-K period. So we know July 1st through June 30th is the pre-K period. You want to maintain documentation of proof of payment based on whatever you use to pay for it, right? So you want to have a canceled check image, the credit card statement, if in fact you utilize the credit card, if you paid for it in cash, your petty cash log, any reimbursement support or policy, make sure it's paid within the pre-K period. And you want to maintain your specialist approval if it's applicable. So when it comes to unreimbursed food costs, one of the things that programs sometimes have a challenge with is identifying what's unreimbursed food costs. So the best way to look at this is what you have coming in as food revenue. Monies do you get as a program that allocated to food? So you may be on the CFP or a National School Lunch Program or the breakfast program. You may charge a fee for food to certain students that are allowed to be charged for food. Or if you charge a lump sum for care, a portion of that fee, if they're paying weekly or monthly, is covering food. So you would need to know how much money you're already getting for food, right? So once you identify how much money you're already receiving for food, then, sorry, then you want to, what's happening with the computer? Sorry. Then you want to take your expenses, and once you less out those expenses, whatever is left will be considered unreimbursed food. So if you have more money than you have expenses, then you don't have any food costs to allocate. However, if you have more expenses than you have funding, there are some pre-K funds can be used to cover those expenses. And so you want to also keep in mind that if you don't buy food for pre-K directly, like most centers and programs provide food for everybody at one time. They don't shop for pre-K separately. So then you have to allocate that, right? When you're talking about food expenses, how much of this should go to pre-K versus non-pre-K? Enrollment is a good way to do that. So what you would do for unreimbursed food expenses is you would say, this is all the money I got in for food. These were my actual expenses. And if there's anything left over that wasn't covered by another funding source, pre-K can cover a portion of those expenses that went to pre-K participants. Okay, so let's move on to our other business rule, which is lead teacher salary. So there are two components that make up salary, but salary is one whole number, right? And so you have your base salary and you have the supplemental compensation. Both must be paid at 100%. So in total, you will be paying one amount to the teacher that reflects everything that you receive from DeCal related to salaries. So to keep in mind, teachers must be paid 100% of the total funded by DeCal. The teachers have to be paid consistent on a consistent schedule, right? So whatever your schedule is for paying employees, that's how you pay That's how it's expected that you're going to pay your teachers. If that's weekly or monthly or bi-weekly or twice a month or whatever the frequency is, 100% of the salary has to be paid at that frequency. The salary cannot be paid as a bonus. So, and you can't hold portion of it to part of the year or until the year is over and try to catch up. Whatever you get should already be factored out in how much you're paying your teachers. You're responsible for communicating with your teachers how they're going to be paid. So they should receive or they must receive written information explaining their base and supplemental compensation if that's applicable. And you have to have them sign a statement that they've received and understand their salary information. So the key takeaway here is 100% of what you receive is what you pay out to your teachers. One thing I want to make sure that you are aware is if you are calculating this on an hourly basis, right, and not salary, and you don't pay teachers when they're out, that substitute teacher that subs in that room, if they're not paid at the same rate, you may be in jeopardy of not paying 100% of that amount funded. So just be sure that you are tracking how much you are paying to your teachers and that it mirrors exactly what you get from right from the start. And so what those salaries look like will be on the salary rate table, and there's going to be a link that you can get to see who you're supposed to pay what amounts. And you'll get a copy of this presentation, so you'll be able to click on that link and identify what the salary rates are. And so as it relates to supplemental compensation, a few things that we want to make sure that you're aware of, and this is all detailed in the operating guidelines in section 12.8. The first is 100% of it has to be paid for the teacher. Has to be paid with the normal pay cycle, and it's not a bonus. It's based on creditable years of experience, so it doesn't necessarily, every single teacher won't necessarily get it. And it only applies to lead teachers. Okay. And some more things to keep in mind is that you're responsible for verifying the teacher's years of credible experience prior to reporting it in Georgia Pre-K, right? So to do that, you should have some written process or policies on file on how you're going to verify that CYE and what you're going to use to verify a teacher's creditable years of experience. And so you're going to be paid based on this information. So if you're selected for an AUP or if Georgia Pre-K decides to do any kind of interim audit and they want to verify that the supplemental compensation received is in fact correct, you will be required to produce documentation that supports that those creditable years of experience that were paid for are in fact valid. So let's talk about the base salary, which we've already done, and you're going to report that on lines 9 and 10. And you want to maintain those detailed payroll records to support the gross salary paid. Be prepared to distinguish what portion of salary is base and what portion is supplemental if the reconciliation requires that. So there may be some changes to the reconciliation, but as it stands right now, the base salary and the supplemental salary are reported on separate lines. And so in order to know which is which, you have to track it, right? In all cases, you want to make sure that you maintain proof of payment that salaries were in fact paid. So that's going to require canceled checks, direct deposit ledgers, some payroll summaries, payroll registers, all the things to support that those teachers were in fact paid, and a written process that supports the CYE and that those particular teachers met the requirements, and any substitute documentation. So if a lead teacher is out and you pay that sub, the amount that you pay for that sub can go towards that lead teacher requirement. And you want to confirm the amount of funding you've received as it relates to teacher salaries on your payment advice from right from the start. That's how you know how much you should be paying out the teachers. So as it relates to assistant teacher salaries, the assistant teacher currently salary has to be reported on line 13. I believe the funding is 25,741.35, and 100% of that must be paid to the assistant teacher. There's no supplemental compensation for assistant teachers. So the whole thing is, rather than getting caught up in a number, how much money you receive in funding for these positions, 100% of that money has to go to the corresponding position, teaching position. So as a best practice, similar to the lead teacher, you want to maintain detailed payroll records to support the gross salary that was paid. You want to maintain proof of payment that supports the net salary, any substitute documentation as it relates to the assistant teacher, and make sure you know how much money you received. Another key point is make sure you're going to have to maintain tax records, because the tax records, you'll have to support that the amount withheld from taxes for lead and assistant teacher or substitutes was forwarded to those taxing authorities as required, because we know that's a component of compensation. And so you would have to support that those taxes were in fact paid. So we talked a lot about payment advice. This is a screenshot of the portal in which you will be going in to, enter your username and password, and you will get access to your payment advice for your organization. And when you do that, you want to use that payment advice to track payments, right? For lead and assistant teacher and your overall monthly payments. So this is kind of your part of your supporting documentation to support how much you should have paid the teachers and how much you actually did receive from Georgia Pre-K. And when you receive a copy of the presentation, you will see the financial user guide link at the bottom that will show you how to access and navigate this new system to read and pull down your payment advice for tracking purposes. So there may be some waivers associated with lead and assistant teacher salary. You want to make sure that you meet all the minimum salary requirements. If there is any instances where there's unused funds for subs paid at a lower rate, you can discuss that with your specialist. But you cannot use any unused salary funds for instructional items. And the pre-K director should submit a request for a waiver if that applies to your organization, to your specialist, and you want to make sure you keep that waiver on file if you are granted approval. So now we're going to move on to our next business rule, which is administrative costs. And this is detailed in the operating guidelines in section 17.1 and reported on pre-K reconciliation line items 20 through 24. So these are the different categories for for administrative costs. Excuse me. So you have director salary, office supplies, bookkeeping and clerical royalties, and that totals your administrative costs. So administrative costs is not credited as a blanket 6% of pre-K funding. So it has to be supported by documentation, and it typically represents a cost allocation of some sort. So we'll use director salary as an example. Most cases, the director of organizations are director for the entire organization, right? And so that means they do various things. So 100% of their salary is not dedicated to pre-K in this particular example. So that means that you have to have a basis of allocating that director's salary to pre-K. A good way to do that could be something like time. So if your director keeps timesheets, and a lot of you all have these sophisticated timekeeping systems where they can allocate or clock in and out according to what they're doing, they can track their time for administrative duties associated with pre-K. Maybe you want to use enrollment. So pre-K enrollment versus non-pre-K enrollment for the whole organization. That's a great way to document it. But if it is a shared responsibility, pre-K is only going to pay for its fair share up to 6%. So that is the cutoff. 6% is what you can use of the pre-K funds to help supplement any administrative costs. So again, this is just illustrating what I'm saying. You can use to cover of your expense. Report what you use, what you've paid for with pre-K funds and administrative should not exceed 6%. However, if you have spent to cover more than that, you will have to return those funds to Bright from the start. So make sure you are tracking the use of the funding and be sure not to use more than 6% of your pre-K budget on administrative expenses. So there's also another line, which is line 25, and that is reserved for additional funding that you may get through the year. If you are a returning an experienced provider, you may be familiar with refurbishment money or special allotment. Those determinations are made throughout the year, so there may be an occasion for you to receive additional funding to keep the classrooms updated or for specific purposes. Anytime something like that happens, you will receive specific written guidelines on how that money is to be spent, but those purchases will be reported on line 25. You'll still have to track how those purchases were spent. You'll still need the same types of documentation to support those purchases. So invoices, receipts, your award letter of those additional funds, the requirements on how those funds are to be used and when they must be expended. In most cases, if you receive additional monies, it has to be spent by the end of the program year, and the end of the program year is June 30th. So let's see how we've done with laying this information to you. What positions and salary components are required to be paid at 100% of the funds issued by Georgia Pre-K? So what positions and salary components are required to be paid at 100%? You can type your response in the chat. Very good. So lead and assistant teacher, right? 100%. So that supplemental portion, the base portion, all the components of the lead teacher salary and assistant teacher salary. Now, this might be a trick question, but we're going to see that you're going to get it, see if you get it right. What position is required to be paid 90% of the funds issued by Georgia Pre-K? What position is that? And everybody needs to get this one right. None, right? Because none. All teachers have to be paid at 100%. So this is driving that point home. Okay, what percentage of pre-K funds can be used for administrative costs? 6%. No more than 6% can be used for administrative costs, and that allocation and supporting documentation has to be maintained. What is the minimum funds to be spent on structural supplies and materials for each classroom? Excuse me. Very good. $1,000 per classroom has to be spent on instructional supplies and materials, and you can find that in Appendix E. How long must program records be retained for the program? Very good. 3 years beyond the agreement ending date or until any of the following situations are resolved if applicable. So if there's litigation or claim or audit or AUP findings, that period is extended. Great job. So a final, I think this is our final poll question, which is true or false. Refurbishment and special allotment expenses, if you get additional funding, are they supposed to be reported on line 25? True or false? Exactly, true. So any additional monies that you get um, over and above your pre-K operating, whether it's, startup has its own line, regular pre-K has its own line. So we're talking about over and above startup and over and above your normal pre-K budget. You need to report that on line 25. And if you are awarded additional funding like refurbishment, it will come with a letter with instructions on what it can be used for, what documentation is required to be maintained, and you will report that on line 25. So let's recap. So 100% column, we've got our lead teachers, base and supplemental salaries, as well as the assistant teacher minimums. 6%, we have our administrative costs. Our record retention is for 3 years and $1,000 minimum on instructional supplies and materials. And so keep in mind that this screenshot represents the business rules that are in place for pre-K, and these are the minimums. You can pay your teacher more. You can spend more in instructional supplies and materials. However, you cannot spend more in administrative costs, but you can spend less, right? So that's a maximum. And 3 years is the record retention requirement unless you have a claim or any kind of findings. All right. So we talked about kind of giving you some best practices on financial management, how to track your program operations in this current year, because at the result, you may be selected for an agreed upon procedure review. And an agreed upon procedure review is where the agency is going to do an overview to determine whether or not the funding was spent as required, right? And so when it comes to an agreed upon procedure review, you want to make sure that you, have an understanding of the process and you have an understanding of, what you're needed to provide. But before I do that, I want to make sure that we don't have any questions that we need to address to the entire group before we go into the audit or AUP.
I think we are good right now. Most of the questions have been very specific, and I've been able to address them in the chat box.
Fantastic. Okay. So preparing for an agreed upon procedures review if you are selected. So first, I wanted to talk about what the difference is between an audit and an agreed upon procedures review. Although you may hear the term interchangeably, typically with Georgia Pre-K, you're getting an AUP, but they may refer to it as an audit. But just technically, an audit is intended to provide a basic level of assurance based on financial statements. So financial statements that will be produced, balance sheet, profit and loss statement, those things, that would be considered an audit. A CPA will provide an opinion on the company's financial statements. Now, what you would be selected for right from the start would be an agreed upon procedures review or an AUP. And so an AUP is where the client determines what procedures are in place to answer specific questions. AUP results in a finding of fact. There is no opinion, and the client ultimately draws the conclusion as to the results. So basically, When it comes to getting an AUP, there is a selection process from right from the start because they are responsible for oversight of the money. And so, as a part of that oversight responsibility, they have to do ongoing monitoring. Part of that monitoring may look like a specialist that comes out during the year to look at certain things with your program and provide technical assistance. And part of that oversight monitoring may be an agreed upon procedures review. All recipients will be monitored at some point or another. And if you happen to get a letter, it may just be your turn. So, no need for you to get all up in arms why you were selected, because everybody at some point will be selected for an AUP or some sort of monitoring. So, in preparing for an agreed upon procedure review, the things you want to do is make sure that you want to do these things during pre-K operations. And then once you get that notification that you've been selected, you want to review your grant agreement, right? Make sure that you know what your responsibilities are. So you should have done that at the very beginning. I know everybody's super excited to be awarded pre-K, but now that we've had this session, go back and take a look at the fine print. Make sure you're aware of what you're required to have. As the year is going along, you want to verify your expenses on a monthly basis. Do not wait until the end when it's time to do your reconciliation to now try to come up with all the records. A best practice is every month, look at what you spent and track it each month by the reconciliation line item numbers. Make sure you have all the documentation you need to support those expenses, right? Perform an internal review. You should know if you're missing a receipt each month or not, and it shouldn't be a surprise when you get to the end. And the last thing is you want to make sure your records tell the story, right? You want to make sure that you're doing these things while you're operating pre-K, and then once you get your notice of being reviewed for an AUP, then you can go through that same process. So during pre-K operations, your grant agreement, right? It's going to tell you all the things that you are required to do. It tells you about the AUP. It tells you the documents that you have to provide, right? So take a look at it. So best practices would be for you to establish and maintain sound record keeping practices that coincide with your grant agreement. You want to attend the reconciliation training. There is a reconciliation training that's offered, and also this training will help you get some best practices in place. It's great to organize information by line item. Maintain all of your source documentation like itemized receipts, bank statements, invoices, credit card statements, shipping statements, ledgers, policies and procedures, canceled checks, all those kinds of things, right? You want to also track your expenses monthly. So compare them to the business rules. Make sure that you're on track. Take a look at your payment advice. Maintain your documentation of waivers and approvals that you receive from your specialists. Maintain documentation of participant records. So part of the AUP process is not only to look at how the money was spent, but to make sure that the participants on your program were in fact eligible, right? So they have to have enrollment type things, ear, eye, and dental forms, all those kinds of things. Health and immunization records, attendance. So they have to attend, you know, for pre-K. Some things that you can do internally is, have monthly financial and programmatic, meaning pre-K specific monitoring, looking at your year-end reconciliation, and then you're going to prepare for your AUP review. So if you track this stuff monthly, it will then tie into your year-end reconciliation. Once you submit your year-end reconciliation, if you're selected for a review, then you're just going to go in and verify all the things that you did, your monthly transactions, as well as what you put on that reconciliation. So it's not a secret what's being looked at when you get an AUP. We're looking for how you spent the money. So after you get the notification that you are selected for an AUP, first thing you want to do is not get overwhelmed, right? You want to be responsive. So you want to make sure that you acknowledge receipt of the engagement notification. You're going to receive a questionnaire. That questionnaire is going to ask you some questions about how you actually operated pre-K. You want to provide the information that was requested because it's used for planning purposes. So there'll be a deadline. The more information you provide in advance, the less time the auditors will be on site at your location because they can do a lot of the work in the planning phase. You want to conduct the dry run. As I said, there's no secret. What we're going to be looking for is support for how you spent the money. So ideally, the scenario is we have your reconciliation. You give us information for each line item, and you can walk away, and we don't have to ask you any questions. That's how thorough your record should be. So if there needs to be explanations, allocation narratives, supplemented with your documentation or addition to your documentation, you want to provide that to the auditors. Do it yourself to make sure you can answer the questions, and you'll be prepared, right? So you want to make sure that you're, like I said, responsive and that you submit things within the deadlines. So what you can expect is you can expect an entrance conference. So that means that the auditors will go over what they're going to do while they're on site. I'm telling you what they're going to do while they're on site. They're going to look at your records related to the reconciliation, how you spent the money, and verify that that's the case. They're going to also look at some things like participant files, attendance records, and health records. They're going to do all that while they're on site at your location. They'll conduct a preliminary exit conference, meaning they will say when they leave, this is what the results of the review looks like. However, there is a QC process, and if there are some additional questions that have to be asked after they leave, then they will follow up with those additional questions. You'll be afforded an opportunity to have a final exit conference, which is typically virtual. And that exit conference is just saying, these are the final numbers that we're going to report to Bright from the start. We're going to ask you to provide us with a management representation letter. That's a letter from your organization to our firm that says you've disclosed everything as it relates to your operation of pre-K to us, the auditors, as of the date that we did the review. And then you'll get a notification from Bright from the start regarding the results of the review. Remember, the AUP is a finding of fact. So, for example, if the question is, were the instructional supplies and material minimum met? Excuse me, the finding of fact is, yes, the instructional supplies of material minimum was met, or no, the instructional supplies and material minimum was not met, and it results in X number of dollars due back to DeKalb. So I'm going to go just show you an illustration of some common findings, and you can find this in section 19.5. So, excuse me, as it relates to findings, like I said, they are findings of fact. Typically, you can have records keeping findings, which there's generally no adverse action, right? So it may be that you didn't keep a certain document on form. You didn't have a written procedure for CYE, or you didn't have a complete set of attendance records. Those are considered record keeping findings. Now, generally, not absolutely always, but generally, there are no adverse actions associated with record keeping findings. Then there are findings, there are funds due back to Bright from the start. There will be for things like some reasons why that may happen is you may not have been able to support your unreimbursed food costs, or you did not meet the minimum salary requirements or instructional supplies or material requirements. You didn't support that you paid the taxes as required to the different agencies, or you just simply didn't support that you used all the money in accordance with the guidelines. And those things can result in monies due back to Bright from the start. When you are completing your reconciliation, you have to be very precise because the reconciliation is supposed to communicate how you use the money that Bright from the start gave you. So it's okay if for example, you underreported in one area and overreported in another area on the actual reconciliation, the total number is going to reflect how much you spent. But you have to keep in mind that those business rules must be met. Okay. And so I want you to make sure that you are very diligent in tracking what you're reporting on each line and that you can support it. Because if you receive $10,000 as your total funding and you're reporting $10,000 in expenses, but you can literally only support 9,500, then $500 will be due back to Bright from the start. And they're not looking to recoup funding. They're trying to make sure that you're successful in having all the tools and resources necessary to properly and completely report how purchases were made and how the funding was used. And so failure to support funding was expended within the program period is another reason why money may be due back. Remember, as I said, funds have to be expended by June 30th, which is the end of the program year, unless otherwise directed. And you have to keep that support on file if you have some other direction. But June 30th is when all money has to be spent. So some common findings are things like reconciliation variances, right? So you may have a variance for a reconciliation. That doesn't necessarily mean that you owe money back. It just means that you reported that you spent $2,000 in instructional supplies and materials, and we verified that you spent $2,100. So you get extra credit for that extra $100 that you spent, right? And so it's just a variance. It's a variance between what you reported and what the auditors were able to support during field work. Another finding would be the minimum not met, and a reason for that could be substitute salary being lower, spending more on administrative costs than the required 6%. So you just take 6%, but you're not able to support it. If you don't have support for the expenses that you use money for, so if you have missing receipts or you don't have canceled checks or credit card statements, so if you pay in cash and you don't have support for that, these are some common reasons why expenses are not supported. Or if you're not adhering to the payment deadline. So if you are paying after the June 30th deadline, you don't get credit for that. And another common finding is active participation not met. So you know that if you don't document interventions with families to show how you are trying to encourage them and support them for being in attendance for pre-K, you're not supporting active participation, that can be a record keeping finding. So some common things that you can do to avoid these common findings. Do that dry run, monitor and track absences for teachers, document your supplement salary, make sure your substitute salary, make sure you are remitting your payroll taxes timely, tracking the minimums within the period, maintain labor records, whatever that happens to be, timesheets, payroll records, things like that, proof of payment for salaries. And make sure you have support for what you're using the money for administrative costs. Also, for unsupported expenses, you want to make sure you maintain those source documents, make sure you maintain proof of payment. Again, I'm driving home. If you use credit cards, make sure you have the receipt plus the credit card statement plus proof of payment. Adhere to those payment down guidelines. So June 30th, make sure everything is out the door by then. And for active participation, document your interventions if you have any kind of attendance problems or challenges. Another thing I wanted to hit on as it relates to the AUP that we see is related to prorating teacher salaries. So if you pay your teacher over 12 months, it has to reflect the work that was done in the 10-month year, right? Operating period. So it can't be for things they're doing in the summertime. It has to be for the things that they're doing during the pre-K period. And you would be expected to have a contract or agreement on file that documents, excuse me, when and how these payments are going to be made, and making sure that that final payment is out the door by June 30th. So it's paid by June 30th, coming out of your bank statement. When it comes to summer salaries, it should be clearly segregated. So if you have a teacher that works in the summer, but also happens to be paid on a 12-month basis, that pre-K salary should be clearly segregated in your payroll records and your accounting records, that this portion is for pre-K and this is for summer salaries, right? Pre-K money cannot be paid to supervise children, um, you know, in private classrooms that are not pre-K, and for things like, doing things that are not pre-K related. And so if you incur summer salary, you want to make sure you have a policy that supports how that summer salary is paid, that it is paid for funds that are not pre-K funds. So your takeaway from all of this, not only the financial management portion, but the AUP portion, is to let your records tell the story, right? Documentation is your friend. And so when it comes to the pre-K reconciliation reporting process, or even the AUP or audit process, you want to make sure that you have a piece of paper or something to support every number that you put on your reconciliation. You want to have support for attendance and eligibility for your pre-K participants, because as I said, oversight will be conducted throughout the year and at the end of the program year. So now that we've gone through all this, you're ready to go. You want to ask your pre-K specialist for guidance if you need any further information. If you have any questions about the AUP process, reach out to Audits and Compliance Division, but rely on your team. You guys are already great business operators. You know what you're doing because you're already doing it for your organization, regardless of the fact that you have pre-K, and just embrace the process. As I said, it may just be your turn, right? So you want to just go ahead and make sure you have everything in place. And once you do that dry run, you already know where your weaknesses are. So you can take the time now to go ahead and make sure that by the end of this pre-K period, you're good to go if you're selected. So this is DECAL's website. I just encourage you to go to the website under Georgia Pre-K. There are tons of helpful tips and resources where you can get information about Georgia Pre-K, about the summer transition program, different forms, the guidelines, all of those things. And so to recap, we talked about the expectation that Georgia Pre-K has for each of you to employ sound business practices. We talked about the benefits of having effective financial management and how that correlates between your overall organization and Georgia Pre-K. We gave you some strategies to support your reported costs for key line items or the pre-K reconciliation, which were those business rules that we talked about. And you should hopefully now understand the purpose of the AUP process and what to expect. And we gave you some best practices, if you are selected, how best to prepare for the agreed upon procedures review. So with that said, excuse me, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to panda.recon@decal.ga.gov. That is still the email address. We know Panda is no more, and there's a new system that will be in place. But right now, if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer during our session together, we encourage you to send us an email. And we will be able to get your questions answered. They will be received and distributed to the right person so they can get you the answers that we need. So before we go, I want to check back in with the team to see if there's any comments, final directions, anything related to attendance, or follow-up questions that we need to address.
Thank you, Sharice. Yes, I actually have two questions. One goes back to the AUP process. If an organization has a finance department that handles a lot of the financial reporting, in a situation where there's an AUP, right now the project director is the one that submits the recon. if there's an AUP, is the pre-K project director solely responsible for answering questions, or can a team be included um, in that interview process?
So whoever has anything to do with the money can absolutely be included, right? So I would suggest that in this particular situation, the program director make the finance department aware of what they are putting on the reconciliation. So if the information comes from the finance department, I would share with the finance department what's required as far as documentation goes, so that everybody that has a part in it is included. So absolutely all parties, not just one, can participate in the AUP process because people may have different responsibilities.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then one question, and I know we get a lot of questions sometimes about allocations. Would it be possible to share maybe one more example of how costs can be allocated appropriately?
Sure. So I think I gave square footage as the first example. So for square footage, if you're doing things that are the not instructional, like those operational costs, utilities, rent, stuff like that, right? You would take the total square footage. You would say this is how much pre-K is using. So it would be the square footage for the pre-K classrooms. You can consider the common areas, right? Um, and you can use square footage. Uh, Another one would be enrollment, right? So if you have an expense and you say, for like director salary, pre-K participants versus non-pre-K participants, whatever that percentage is, you can apply that percentage to the director's salary, and that would be pre-K's portion to cover that salary up to 6%. Another allocation example could be something like if you have a copy machine, and you know how for those of us that have those copy machines with the automated counters, if you have a code that you do codes for pre-K, and if they're making copies, you can use the number of pre-K code copies associated with that code over the number of copies made for everything else, something like that. You can use revenue as it relates to things like bookkeeping, right? So pre-K revenue versus non-pre-K revenue, the percentage of that applied to bookkeeping and clerical, because they're going to be doing the books for the entire organization, just not pre-K. So those are some examples that you can use that are reliable and that you can support. Because whatever allocation you use, you have to come back with a supporting documents. Usage. I know like Georgia Power, they can give you like a usage report, and you can, for certain spaces. You don't have to get that technical, but those are things that you can use for allocations. So hopefully that was helpful. But if you have a specific question, feel free to send an email and maybe we can provide a little bit more information. I do want to just take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us and hanging in there with us today. I know it was a lot of information, but hopefully it will be helpful for you as you are administering pre-K this year, so that you can start tracking if you weren't already doing it, so that you can be on track by the time of the end of the program year. And if you get selected for an agreed upon procedures review, you will be ready.